Israel and Hezbollah are at the closest point to war since October 7th, after an amazing intelligence and operational coup in Lebanon targeting thousands of Hezbollah terrorists in simultaneous pager blasts. We'll talk about that. We'll also talk about the year that was with legendary Israeli journalist Ilana Dayan, and an exclusive interview with a certain British journalist making a lot of news this week, who is conveniently for me also my co-host. It's Unholy. I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London. Unholy, two Jews on the news. Lots of news for us to talk about, including, yes, some matters close to home, which I've actually not talked about anywhere until now. So we'll get into all of that.
Can I just pause for a moment and make the point that if any of our listeners think it was at all easy for me to land an exclusive interview with Jonathan Friedland, the hero of one of this week's, conundrums, because I'm his co-host. No. He wanted to talk to many other news outlets, but I had to deploy my army of common sense, Jewish guilt, and maybe a smidgen of some passive-aggressive behavior to get to that.
We'll get onto this later, but it was completely defy my expectations. You work as a journalist for a long time. You think you know what will be news, what won't be. If you had told me that the thing that we're going to get onto later would have had NBC, the BBC, Sky, National Public Radio, the New York Times, and on and on and on, all asking to interview me about this event, I would not have agreed with you. I would not have predicted that. I'd have said that's not going to happen. As it happens, as soon as the thing broke, you said Unholy exclusive on Friday and held me to it. So this is going to be the first time that I will have spoken about it. But we'll get on to that because there is big news. I mean, really jaw-dropping news.
You wanted to say explosive, didn't you? Explosive news?
I was resisting that. I mean, it's even people who have condemned it, we'll get onto that too, have said this was something out of a thriller, this was something out of a movie, and redefines, in a way, the rules of engagement of this kind of warfare around the world. So we haven't said what it is. Why don't you just tell us how it unfolded?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, it kind of is taken out of a Hollywood action film. On 4 p.m. Israel time on Tuesday, the pagers and walkie-talkies of thousands of Hezbollah operatives simultaneously explode. These blasts occur mainly in the Dahia, which is the suburb of Beirut, the stronghold of Hezbollah, but also close to the southern border, close to the Syrian border, all around Lebanon. These explosions occur, also reportedly injuring hundreds. And one of the injured is also the Iranian ambassador to Lebanon. Essentially, someone succeeded in penetrating Hezbollah's secret communications network, installing remote-controlled explosive devices into this communications network. And this really is, you must say, if it is indeed Israel, which has been blamed and officially has not taken any responsibility, it's clearly an operational maneuver that has been planned over years and is kind of a thing that is clearly a game changer in this story. We should remind our listeners, perhaps, right, that Hezbollah has attacked Israel since October 8th, already for many years in a violation of the UN decision 1701, which is to be far away from the border with Israel. And when this is the essentially largest terrorist army in the world, this is a way to maybe tell it to pull back.
So I think the news that this made around the world, firstly, was on the lines that we were both saying just at the start there, that just as a matter of tradecraft, operationally, it is a stunning achievement to have done this sort of thing that you would, as you say, put in a movie. People would not have guessed this was possible. So there was kind of initial admiration, as it were, for the technical prowess of this. But very quickly, people have paid attention not to those who were targeted, but to the fact that in the walkie-talkie blast that happened the second day, some 20 have been killed, and the exploding pagers round killed 12, including some who clearly were not Hezbollah operatives, including children. I think a young girl was killed. And therefore, this has been described, you had, I think, is the Deputy Prime Minister of Belgium saying this is a terror attack. You've had condemnation in other places. It's one of those moments where the disconnect, the gap between how Israel sees what it does and countries now around the world view it is wide, because I think in Israel there was a sense that, wow, this is incredible, aren't we great for having pulled this off? And we've only got the bad guys, and immediately the interest around the world has been focused on the, as it were, dread phrase, collateral damage. And there will be some who will say, well, that's always how it's going to be. That's how people around the world are going to look at Israel, the most unsympathetic gloss possible. I would say there's a difference, and that had this happened a year ago, I suspect there would have been more of the Israeli reaction to it around the world, that people would have been concentrating on the technical prowess, but also would have thought, okay, Hezbollah is an enemy of Israel. It's not Palestinian. It's not campaigning to free occupied territory in the way that Palestinian groups would say they're in that business. I know there's this Sheba Farms thing in southern Lebanon, but that's not, they can't claim to be acting directly for, an occupied people. I think there would have been some more sympathy for Israel. Instead, I suspect that the last year has drained a lot of the goodwill, because, if you go outside the United States and outside Germany, which has obviously historic reasons for this, most countries start from an assumption after the last year of ill will, and they just assume the worst motives. And so there has not been the whooping and cheering and round of applause that I think some people would have thought. On the contrary, they've just thought, yeah, hi, Hezbollah operatives. But look, you did it in a supermarket, you did it in a grocery store, and there were other people around, and therefore this was dangerous. I just think it's an example of how different this looks inside and outside yet again.
So I would say a few things. First of all, I don't think there's whooping and cheering in Israel either. Contrary to some of our enemies, we are not, generally speaking, gloating when people are injured, even if those people are our enemies. I think the main question in Israel, and we should get to that, is what is the goal of this kind of operation, if indeed it is Israel? But I would want to respond to what you describe as the world's reaction. And to me, what you're saying is really indicative of how the world thinks about Israel. Because what was the main claim, and what still is the main critique of what Israel is doing in Gaza? Even people who support Israel and support the fight against Hamas are saying, kill as many terrorists as you want, but you can't hurt civilians in this magnitude. Now, what was this operation in Lebanon? A precise answer to that claim. It was, meaning, what I mean by this is anyone who carried the pager of encrypted messages from the world's biggest terrorist army is a bad guy. And this was intended to hurt, not even kill, by the way. Look at the numbers of how many pagers exploded and how many people were killed. This was intended to hurt them and not to hurt anyone around them. In most cases, that worked. And instead of the world saying, that is a remarkable precision and attempt at solving exactly what we were saying was the matter in Gaza, the world is yet again dissatisfied with Israel. What it shows you, I think, is that it was never about caring deeply about the Palestinian civilians hurt. It was, more than anything, being dissatisfied with whatever Israel is doing. So that is to that point. Now, I think when we are discussing what is the goal, I think that is the most important question, because this kind of operational success is intended for one or two things. One is to prevent war, and the other is to start a war. That sounds like I was saying something contradictory, but I'm not. Either what Israel was doing, if it is indeed Israel, was thinking that Hezbollah might start an all-out war with Israel and trying to prevent it by saying, we have the technology to do this, now back off. Or Israel was saying, this is our opening salvo of an all-out war with Hezbollah. Either way, it makes sense. It is probably not an operational tool that you should use to either show off your technical abilities or we use this or press the red button on this because we were fearful that we might be discovered. If that indeed is the case, it's a big question. Why would you use it now?
Let's just go back quickly to the world reaction point, because I think we're not far apart on this. I think my point was, had you asked me a year ago how the world would react to an attack like this, I would have said, I suspect they will be more, as it were, forgiving and understanding of Israel. And they'll say, yeah, you weren't killing civilians, you weren't aiming at a civilian area. These were very targeted. It's Hezbollah, it's not Hamas. They don't have the, as it were, justification of fighting occupation. Hezbollah have a mighty arsenal. They've been attacking in the north. There would be a degree of understanding. And yet here we are a year later, and there isn't. And I'm suggesting that's because the pool of goodwill, which a lot of people listening to this will say was very shallow anyway, has been drained further by the last year. That's really the point I was making. And as if to underline your point, a word that even leapt out, I must say, at me, and it was some international figure, and I can't remember who it was, a governmental leader, describing this as an indiscriminate attack. Now, you may say that there were too many civilians who were injured or killed in this attack, but it's a weird word to use to call it indiscriminate when the explosions were specifically and could not reach anyone but a Hezbollah operative. So, it's an odd one to say. One thing I would like to know more about is, does everyone who carries a Hezbollah pager, are they, as it were, in the military side of Hezbollah, which after all
and not the delivery side, and not just the delivery guy for Hezbollah?
No,
is that what you're asking?
I don't mean that, no, but they are a political party that's represented in the Lebanese parliament. Were they also carriers of pages? I don't know. And some people in Israel may think there's no distinction between them, but I think, for example, back in Northern Ireland, there was the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, there was the political wing Sinn Féin who would take part. Are the pager carriers all one group lumped together, or was there any distinction? I don't know.
This is people who carried the Hezbollah pager for encrypted operational messages, including, we should also say, the Iranian ambassador to Lebanon. To anyone still doubting, they are all part of the same conglomerate, right?
Yeah.
So these are the people who are carrying these pagers. And again, I have no doubt that if the world was not unbelievably biased against Israel, so you would see much more of the world amazed at this operational and intelligence achievement, and I think much less criticism.
Yeah. So let's go to your point about the goal, because I think that is the thing that leapt out of me. I thought this is obviously a tactical masterstroke. It's stunning. It demoralizes Hezbollah's military capacity. It weakens it. And it sort of knocks them off their feet. And I think may actually have a very practical achievement in the sense of this is the communications network. And now they're not able to connect with each other, as well as injuring a lot of people who were involved in the fight against Israel and firing rockets against Israel every day since October the 7th. So tactical mastery. But again, I do ask myself, and I note that you are in a way searching for an answer to this too. What was the strategic goal? And it strikes me that this is something we've been saying about the war itself since October the 7th. What is the larger plan? What is the bigger picture here? And I don't think you can answer that because, as you say, it could have been the opening salvo in a war. And we are told that that's what this capacity was actually for, was to disable Hezbollah's fighting capacity seconds before an Israeli offensive. And that actually the reason for it being used now was not because there was an immediate offensive, but there were reports that Hezbollah had got wise to this trick, that this was coming, and that therefore Israel was confronted by a situation essentially of use it or lose it. That if they didn't do this now, they were never going to be able to do it. And it's too good a bit of kit not to use, and so they used it. I really hope that isn't the reason, because again, that goes to the tactical. What is the larger purpose? If it's to start a war, okay, you get that. But then you think, why would you want to do that in a situation where the country is already exhausted and stretched fighting Hamas at the south, and Hamas and Hezbollah does have such a mightier arsenal than Hamas, to cross the road to start that fight? I know the argument is, well, you're going to have to do it eventually. We have to push Hezbollah out of southern Lebanon. But there are at least other avenues you could explore first. And the Americans have been saying from the start that there is a diplomatic route to this, which is ceasefire in Gaza, and then you can talk to Hezbollah about a pullback. And there are signs that both Hezbollah and their Iranian masters do not want a war right now and might have been open to some kind of diplomatic option. But instead, this, like the assassination of Fuad Shukra, again, militarily justified, big Hezbollah commander, that they only push things further and further to the brink and make war more likely. And I would like to hear a strategic argument for that rather than just a day-to-day tactical advantage argument of the kind I think this points to.
What we heard from, let's say leaks that came out from Israel, from Israeli officials, was indeed that they were concerned that this would burn out because Hezbollah was already onto the plan. You can ask if that is the true story, and I'm not sure it is, by the way, because there's a lot of misinformation. Would that be the right, time to press the button? Because this is a very big deal. And maybe the rest of it is that Israel's decided that the only way to solve a situation that has been going on for a year, in which Hezbollah is the aggressor, and I will remind you, tens of thousands of Israelis have been evacuated from their home. The only way to solve it is a large-scale war. And this is the first opening strike. So there are still more questions than answers here. But what is clear is, indeed, if this is Israel doing it on just every level, it is such a contradictory operation to what we saw, to the abject failure of October 7th. This is something of, Israel bringing back to itself some of that, I think, self-confidence, which is also important. But look, only in Israel, Jonathan, could all this be happening when, Israel is on the brink of war with Hezbollah, intertwined with this huge political drama that has been going on this week. So sensitive security discussions and deliberations are happening while Netanyahu is passing notes between his advisors and himself about his next political move. This is Israel on steroids. And I probably need to sort of walk our listeners through what has been going on this week, where the headline is Netanyahu's attempt to replace Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, in the middle of a war, if one should add, with a member of Knesset, Gideon Sa'ar. So are you ready for this? It's going to be a bumpy ride. We can explain what is going on. Essentially, these are two different political maneuvers that have sort of converged into one. Netanyahu has been long trying to get rid of Yoav Gallant ever since he last tried to do that, which was March of last year. I remind you, he then tried to fire Yoav Gallant because Gallant was warning him publicly of the repercussions of the judicial overhaul to Israel's security. He then fired him. There were spontaneously erupted protests all around Israel. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis, most of them probably didn't vote for Netanyahu's party or wanted Yoav Gallant as defense minister. All were protecting this man, and Netanyahu walked it back. So ever since he has been wanting to fire him, obviously October 7th kind of got in the middle of that. And Yoav Gallant, the main thing that Netanyahu's problem with him is the fact that Gallant is the obstacle to the draft bill. Draft bill, we explained this a lot. We should probably call it the exemption from draft bill. The ultra-Orthodox parties want this bill because they want an official exemption from military service in the middle of a war. I will probably stress that. Again, Yoav Gallant said he will not support this and he will not be the one to bring it forward. What happened in recent weeks is the ultra-Orthodox threatened Netanyahu that if he will not bring this bill to the Knesset, they will not support the budget. And if they don't support the budget, the coalition has to dissolve. Gideon Sa'ar, I will talk about him a lot, but what you need to know importantly to this story is he will probably not be an obstacle to the draft bill. So maybe we should say a few words about Gideon Sa'ar himself, the man in the headlines this week.
Do say something about why he wouldn't be an obstacle on the draft bill, why he's prepared to go where Yoav Gallant was not and is not prepared to go.
So first of all, Gideon Sa'ar is one of those political creatures that we have been seeing more and more of in recent years, meaning a right-wing politician that is anti-Bibi. He was part of the Likud. He left the Likud after trying to run against Netanyahu and losing. In 2019, he set up his own party called New Hope. Someone saw too many Star Wars movies as a teenager. In any case, that was the party that he set up. And for the better part of the last 5 years, he's been probably the loudest speaker against Netanyahu himself, including, I remember in the studio saying to me in 2020, I urge anyone who wants Netanyahu to be a prime minister not to vote for me. And saying, I will never support a man who puts the interests of himself before the good of the country. His main friction, this is very interesting, his main friction point with Netanyahu being the judicial overhaul. I mean, Gideon Sa'ar always likes to say about himself that he's the Menachem Begin Likud, not the Benjamin Netanyahu Likud, which means he is ferociously protecting the judiciary. He was actually marching in the protests against the judicial overhaul. And, you know, really being this sort of very loud critic of Netanyahu, to the extent, the irony of ironies here is, of course, that after Yoav Gallant was fired in March of last year, he wrote on Twitter, this is insanity. Every day that Netanyahu is still in power endangers Israel. So really, what I'm trying to sort of explain or reiterate here, if we were on a scale of the Benny Gantz scale of breaking political promises, right? So if Benny Gantz, I'll remind you, said, I will never, ever join Netanyahu's government, pinky swear, and then only to join Netanyahu's government, Gideon Sa'ar, if he does this, will be way off the charts. This will be a political zigzag to trump every other political zigzag, but that is where we are right now.
And the fear I have about this is we talked about demoralization before in a very different context. How this degrades Israeli politics, particularly in the minds of voters. How disillusioned you would be that if somebody breaks such an overt, explicit promise that actually it becomes their entire political identity, that I'm the guy to vote for if you don't want Netanyahu, as you say, even on those marches against the judicial coup, and then he reverses. I think it just absolutely plays to that sense that these politicians always break their promises, they always lie, they're all as bad as each other. It feeds a terrible cynicism, even a kind of nihilism about politics. I think it's awful. The question I have to ask is why now? What has changed? Because presumably the door was open from Netanyahu for a job for Gideon Sa'ar before Netanyahu, when he formed this coalition. We knew he wasn't, hugely keen on being dependent on the votes of Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich. He would have liked to have had Gideon Sa'ar in his coalition. It would have meant given him more room for manoeuvre. You can't exactly say that Netanyahu has proved this last year or so that he does not put himself first, and that actually he's always selflessly puts the country first. I would suggest the evidence points in the other direction. So what has exactly changed that makes Gideon Sa'ar able to join now, when before, it was kind of over my dead body will I ever help Netanyahu?
Yeah. So first of all, we need to just not to overcomplicate things, but we should just remind our listeners that Gideon Sa'ar, together with Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot, did join Netanyahu's coalition right after October 7th to sort of stabilize the coalition, and they thought they were doing something good because of those far-right elements that you mentioned. Gideon Sa'ar then left the coalition in March, and Benny Gantz and Eisenkot left in June, all of them feeling like they're not making a difference. To answer your question, if I was sitting here and I'm not as Gideon Sa'ar's spokesperson, I would say that what changed dramatically was October 7th. And that whatever critique of Netanyahu you heard from him before now changed into a critique of the war, which came from the right more than from the left, saying you should do more in Gaza or things like that. By the way, doesn't support any of the plans for a hostage deal, which makes all of the hostage families very worried about him being a defense minister. But what he would say is, I don't think the war is run properly, and I would run it differently. So that is the answer to what changed. What changed, in brief, is October 7th, and that will be the case. We should say this is not an easy thing to swallow for Likud voters either, because Likud voters saw this man for many years as a traitor, worse than any other traitor, because he came from the Likud, right? He's even worse than Bennett. Remember, Gideon Sa'ar joined Bennett's government. He was Minister of Justice. By the way, he's also the man who appointed Attorney General Gali Baharav Miara, who is now considered by Netanyahu supporters the biggest thorn in Netanyahu's side. So they don't like it either. The reports coming out this week saying Sarah Netanyahu is actually the impediment to this because she thinks he's a traitor. And a lot of them are saying, wait a minute, if you want to put someone in place that instead of Yoav Gallant, why are you not putting someone in place that has any sort of security or defense experience? So it's very hard for all of the sides to swallow, but from the political only, and I see the smoke coming out of your ears, YouTube viewers will see it too, just from the political calculation here. If Netanyahu's biggest problem for surviving politically is the draft bill and the threats coming from the ultra-Orthodox, he needs to remove the threat, which is Yoav Gallant, and to bring in someone who will be, again, you know how these things are going to be phrased by lawyers, right? It's not that he supports the draft bill, but he will set up a committee that will review whether you really need to block it or not. That's how it's going to work. And that is the plan.
Yeah. No, I don't think there was steam coming out of my ears, this one. I mean, I was actually, there's plenty that does make me, livid with anger, but this just seems to me
I was promoting our YouTube page. That's what I was doing. This seems
to be par for the course for that kind of cynicism. I mean, you mentioned this thing about traitors. Just a small note, but pretty well everyone on the non or anti-Netanyahu right is an ex-associate of Netanyahu. So Naftali Bennett worked directly for him. So did Avigdor Lieberman and Gideon Sa'ar is ex-Likud. They are all, in a way, ex or refugees or exiles from the Likud family. So in a way, if you hold this scruple that you can't work with traitors, you really, the gene pool that you're going to pick from is going to be pretty small. On the point about the draft bill, I think this is one of those cases where, I can see the coalition arithmetic, but Yoav Gallant, it seems to me, is much more where the country is on this issue. There was always a rumbling issue about the ultra-Orthodox failing to do their bit for the country's defense. We had, I think, an interview that is still talked about. People still talk to me about it on this podcast with Rivka Ravitz, who explained explicitly really well why they are just never, ever going to do it. And it's because they fear their sons, their daughters, but particularly their sons, becoming secular. For them, that is a mortal danger, and the country may need to be physically defended, but they're not going to do it if there's a risk that their child comes back. Most people worry about their child not coming back. They worry about their child coming back no longer wearing a kippah, no longer keeping Shabbat. A lot of people were stunned by that interview. So we know how serious this is for them. The rest of the country knew that before. They were ready to swallow it after October the 7th. They're just not. The idea of a whole body of the country, a large percentage of the country, not willing to do its bit. And so, politically, tactically, to make that distinction again, it gets Netanyahu through another day, another week. Strategically, it puts him on the opposite side, I think, of the majority of the country, including, I think we know this, a big chunk of Likud voters who also feel that the Orthodox should put their shoulder to the wheel. And all of this goes to what I consider still the enduring mystery of Yoav Gallant, which is in any other parliamentary system around the world, a situation like this would have resolved itself long ago with Gallant leaving the coalition, breaking from it, and taking 4 like-minded members of Knesset with him, crossing the aisle and actually giving the numbers to another government in which he would carry on as defense minister. Parliamentary politics, that's how it works. People break off and do that sort of thing all the time. It's a mystery to me why it hasn't happened, unless Yoav Gallant is one of these Yoav no-mates people. He has got no friends and no one will leave him. I struggle to believe that, because we know there are disenchanted people inside Likud, but it hasn't happened. It's why the myth of Netanyahu as some kind of magician endures, because I would put money on it. Any other country, any other parliamentary system in the world, that's how this would have resolved itself.
So first of all, you said it yourself. Yoav Gallant doesn't have an independent base in the Likud. when Netanyahu was in opposition and the change government or anti-Netanyahu government was in place, Naftali Bennett then being prime minister, the only thing Netanyahu and his people were busy doing was trying to scrape off members of Knesset to cut from that government and join their coalition. They eventually succeeded. And that taught many people on the right who were in the anti-Netanyahu camp that there is what they think there's no future on the other side. So it's very hard to convince someone to move into that direction. And I don't think Yoav Gallant is busy doing that because he's busy running a war. So that is where we are. Of course, you could continue this question and ask about the Israeli opposition and their failings and shortcomings, but we don't have enough time in this episode. So we'll have to move on to different topics. Moving on to different Jewish drama and a conundrum in the world's oldest Jewish newspaper, hit by scandal and now hit by resignation. The man resigning from the Jewish Chronicle is sitting across from me on our conversation right now, making a lot of news. What should I say? Jonathan Friedland, welcome to Unholy. In this exclusive interview about your decision to resign from the Jewish Chronicle.
Yeah, no, it is exclusive because, as we said right at the top, I haven't talked about it anywhere, and I was waiting till coming on here because I knew that obviously we would talk about it. And I said to you before, I think I was really shocked that this had such a reach because to me, look, the Jewish Chronicle matters to me, as I explained in the resignation letter which I put out. I've been writing it for it myself since 1998. I've been a columnist on the Jewish Chronicle, monthly columnist for incredibly 26 years. But I have to say more deeply than that, it's the connection is very, very profound. I mean, for one thing, most British Jews, a lot of British Jews, let's not say most, a lot of British Jews feel that their lives are played out on the pages of the Jewish Chronicle in the most literal sense, in that my birth was announced on the pages of the Jewish Chronicle. So it was, my sister's the same. My marriage was announced on the pages of the Jewish Chronicle, and the deaths of my parents were announced on those pages. And that's how the Jewish community in this country speaks to itself, to each other, is through that pages. The paper had this even in my day, even as a child rather, it was quaint, this phrase, the organ of British Jewry, sort of 19th century phrase. But in a way, it's an apt phrase because, a few years back when the Jewish Chronicle seemed to be facing the threat of closure, I wrote that the Jewish Chronicle is the beating heart of the Jewish community. And it really is true. I don't think there is an institution that is common to all the Jews in Britain in the way that the JC, as everyone calls it, is. So for all those reasons, coming to the decision I did was very, very hard.
So what happened? Why did you arrive at that decision?
Well, there's an immediate answer, and then there's the sort of underlying answer. As always with these things, I think you realise now when you read about resignations. I remember somebody telling me as a political reporter, there's never just one thing. There's always a sort of backstory. There'll be the latest thing, but that's only the latest thing, and it's like that here. So the latest thing is, and I think it's made news even before this happened, was a series of articles that appeared under the byline of Elon Perry. We've since discovered that is not the real name for a man who said that he was, and he is, by all accounts, a veteran of the IDF, but he said he was at the Entebbe raid in 1976. He said that he had been an academic for many years at Tel Aviv University. These claims did not survive further examination, but he was published in the Jewish Chronicle a series of what appeared to be fantastic scoops, intelligence stories, culminating in one that claimed to have evidence that documents that Yahya Sinwar was saying that he aimed to spirit hostages held in Gaza out of the country, across the Egyptian border, into Iran or Egypt, where they would never be able to be rescued or even perhaps seen ever again. And this story seemed to show vividly the necessity of the Philadelphia corridor to act as a kind of barrier to prevent the taking away of these hostages. Indeed, this story appeared all but simultaneously with this argument being made by Benjamin Netanyahu. You'll remember we talked about it on here. He suddenly introduced this new red line, the Philadelphia corridor. Netanyahu said we cannot possibly agree to a ceasefire or hostage release deal because it would mean giving up this corridor. And as if on cue, this story appears in the Jewish Chronicle under the byline Elon Perry, saying, well, yeah, we've got the proof that Sinwar plans to, if that corridor goes, he'll take hostages away. Now, a series of denials appeared, but most importantly, I think in this context, was the IDF itself described these as, in various different terms, but essentially false, and said they were, the phrase wild fabrications was used. These stories were bogus. The Jewish Chronicle announced an investigation, and 24 hours later, the stories were removed from the website, and the paper said it was severing its links to Elon Perry. As I say, for me, along with Hadley Freeman, David Aronovich, the journalist or the author, writer, comedian David Baddiel, all writers for the Jewish Chronicle, all of us said at this point, we're not going to carry on doing it. And I wrote that I was breaking my connection with the paper because I no longer recognized it. This was in some ways the latest of a series of lapses, which is, again, perhaps putting it mildly, but it was embedded in a larger context.
So I want to ask about the I mean, I have a lot to ask about, but I want to ask about the context. But before we get to the context, just two maybe even clarifying questions. One, what do you think about that connection, right? The coincidence between Netanyahu actually mentioning on record that the Philadelphia line is the barrier that prevents hostages from being, taken away to the Sinai or to Iran even, and this story coming out in the Jewish Chronicle. And the other thing is, does it matter at all that he has been fired and that the paper apologized in your decision to resign?
So let's do the first thing first. I don't know is the answer. I know there is a lot of speculation, informed speculation from people who got in touch with me to say this clearly comes out of, or all the signs suggest this comes out of the Netanyahu orbit. We know, you know better than most as a journalist working in Israel, how that operates, where it doesn't have to be an on-the-record briefing from the Prime Minister for Team Netanyahu to get things out into the world. An interesting thought is, did they try this with an Israeli domestic outlet who maybe even, really outlets usually very sympathetic to Netanyahu, who maybe looked at this and said, this is too much even for us. This is obviously bogus. We're not going to do it. Or did they perhaps want the story to appear in the foreign press? Stories did appear also in Bild, the German publication, and in the Jewish Chronicle. Either way, it did not pass even the most basic test. I would argue simply because of the authorship. You just had to spend 5 minutes with Google to check out this guy and to see that it did not all add up. The being a veteran of Entebbe, the Tel Aviv University thing, the quotes on his self-published book, just none of it stacked up. You should have, I think, immediately been alerted. Your point was, does it make a difference? Okay, I think the initial statement did not really reflect the seriousness of what had happened. And I felt the apology afterwards was pretty, the way I wrote it in my resignation letter was this was the thinnest form of contrition. I think it didn't match the seriousness of the offence. But had this been a complete one-off with no backstory, maybe you'd say, well, look, it's a terrible mistake, but we all make mistakes. This gets us to the larger point, which is the ownership of the Jewish Chronicle. This is that larger context, and this actually is the heart of the matter. For me, so the ownership of the Jewish Chronicle changed. I joined, as I mentioned, in 1998. I've been writing a column all this time. In 2020, during the pandemic, it wasn't just rumor. It came very close to being the case that the Jewish Chronicle was going to fold, that it was going to go out of business. I and others were desperately sad by that, the idea that this vital newspaper could disappear. Out of nowhere, a rescue bid came to save the paper. The choice then was either the paper disappears or it's saved. Obviously, I thought better for it to be saved. The drawback was the rescuer never identified himself, herself, themselves. We've never known. And to me, the secrecy of the ownership is the central thing, I think, because when these new owners appeared out of nowhere, I thought, well, look, that's better than the paper not existing at all. And I thought I was prepared to give it a go. And I, even from my very first conversation with the editor they appointed, Jake Wallace-Simons, I said to him, obviously we need to know who these owners are. And the response was always, yes, in good time. They're reluctant now, but we are going to find a way to do this. And every few weeks or months, I would say, so where are we up to with transparency? Because obviously it's important. And on it has gone. And that is really the context. So to be totally truthful with you, because I can be no other way, I thought about doing this quite a lot in the last few years. And each time, I as somebody wrote to me and said, you let your eternal optimism get the better of you. People who listen to me on this podcast may be surprised to hear that my actual disposition is optimistic. I did always think this will resolve itself and something will come along. But it hasn't, and it didn't, and there were no signs that it would. There were moves to, for example, set up a trust, but I couldn't see that wouldn't actually be anything other than another layer of opacity rather than transparency, that was going to make it even harder to know who was behind it.
Can I ask an Israeli question, not an English question?
Yeah.
So I have been getting calls from people who think I'm your spokesperson. I'm fine with that as long as you pay me. And saying essentially we get why Jonathan decided to leave the Jewish Chronicle. But then how does he put up with still being at The Guardian? So I'm transferring that hot potato to you.
Yeah, no, and I've been hearing that. And of course, people are going to ask that. I think the point is, look, you could get into a whole argument about this very specific story and say, there's one thing running stories you don't like, opinion columns you don't like, even news stories where you would have written it differently, and running wholesale fabrications, right? Bogus stories about a story of huge import. And by the way, there are reports that Sarah Netanyahu said to the families of the hostages, you've got to listen to my husband because otherwise foreign media are saying you'll never see your loved ones again because they're going to be spirited away to Iran. In other words, this was a story of enormously high stakes, and it was, by all accounts, fabricated. So that is a very serious, egregious thing, and different from just a headline you don't like or a cartoon you don't like. This is a different order. But let's say you don't think that. The huge and glaring difference is, of course, if you write for a newspaper, there's always going to be stories you don't like and things that you would never yourself write, alongside the things you admire. The journalism of brilliant colleagues that you absolutely stand behind. But as my colleague Hadley Freeman, who also ended her relationship with the Jewish Chronicle, she put it, part of being a grown-up is compromise, and you compromise and you keep doing that until the negatives outweigh the positives. That's how she put her decision. To me, the heart of the matter is the issue of the secrecy of the ownership. You can have all the disagreements you like with The Guardian, let's say. I might have disagreements, but at least I know who owns the newspaper. In The Guardian's case, it's a charitable trust, and there is no secret money man or woman behind it. But it is very, very hard to hold an institution to account if you don't know who hires and fires the person at the top. It means you don't know what is motivating those decisions. Now, maybe the owners are keeping this quiet because you only get grief if you own a communal Jewish newspaper, and they would rather not have that. Maybe, that is the most benign reading, I think. The other reading is that the owner has a very distinct political agenda and knows that the credibility of the Jewish Chronicle would be diminished if people knew who owned it. I don't know. That's possible.
You're a very good interviewee, Jonathan Friedland.
I think there's been no questions from me. This is a weird interview.
Okay. It is weird.
I need to ask myself something.
You go.
No, I was just going to say one other thing about just the politics of it, because it's been written about it up everywhere as sort of pro-Netanyahu paper. And it's definitely true that the Jewish Chronicle in its most recent incarnation has been much more hawkish than me and more sympathetic to Netanyahu than me. I would say two things about that. First, I think that it's not just then out of step with me, it's out of step with a big chunk of the British Jewish community. The shop window that the Jewish Chronicle represents to the rest of the country is understood by the rest of the country as being, that must be what the Jewish community think. And yet there are many people in the Jewish community who are not in lockstep with the government of Israel, nevertheless are very sympathetic and pro-Israel and, have huge family ties to Israel. If you read the Jewish Chronicle, you would not sense that degree of diversity of opinion. There's polling, it's not done often, but there's polling in the Jewish community which shows actually the attitudes that I was writing in the Jewish Chronicle are pretty mainstream in the British Jewish community in terms of two-state solution, existence of a Palestinian state, despair at Netanyahu, opposition to settlements in the West Bank. Those are pretty mainstream Jewish positions. Again, I don't think you'd have got that sense reading the Jewish Chronicle. And so it didn't really reflect the plurality of the community in this incarnation. Again, you put up with it and you do your bit to redress that by writing your own columns and everything. But difficult when the ownership was as it was. And the second thing is about domestic UK politics. The paper became very sympathetic to a particular kind of quite right-wing position in the culture wars. And so, for example, the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, who was really, talking about multiculturalism is dead and very often training her fire on Britain's Muslim community. Lots of British Jews are not in that place. And yet, when Suella Braverman was branding the pro-ceasefire protests, the pro-Gaza protests as hate marches, the Jewish Chronicle went all in behind her. Again and again, there were just examples of that where it felt as if it was in one place when a lot of British Jews were in another. Like I say, I think that could have been tolerated if we knew fully, openly and transparently who ultimately calls the shots. And we didn't, and we still don't.
Jonathan Friedland, it was a pleasure talking to you today on Unholy.
Good to be with you, Yoni Levy.
So what we have been trying to do on Unholy in recent weeks, and will continue to do so, is to pause for a moment and try and think about the year that was and its significance to Israelis and to Jews around the world, and to speak to people that we, I think in a way, are inspired by about this topic, to get some perspective about where we are and where we are heading.
As October the 7th approaches, we're doing a series of conversations on Unholy, reflections really on the year that's been. And when we thought of that idea, perhaps the very first name on the team sheet, the person we knew we had to speak with, is our guest this week.
Ilana Dayan is a giant of Israeli broadcasting, a lawyer, investigative journalist, and anchor of the flagship Uvda program, one of Israel's most respected voices, and a dear friend and a person that I definitely turn to every time I need to somehow make sense of the world. So, Ilana, thank you so much for being on Unholy again. We're grateful.
It's worth coming for the compliment and the introduction. Thank you so much, both of you. Thanks.
Wait for the rest of the conversation.
Yeah, right.
And you know, I want to begin our conversation. Last time we talked was December of 2023. And so much has happened since. But I kind of want to start with the fact that we're talking on Thursday night. Israel seems to be really on the brink of a war with Hezbollah. And I guess my first question would be, how confident are we supposed to be that the people, at the helm are thinking about this deeply, strategically, seriously, about all the ramifications of this?
We cannot be. We cannot be because of their record over the last year, because politics has spilled over the hostages deal and the war in Gaza and the ceasefire and Rafah and Philadelphia route, because I'm afraid that there's no one room in which the deep strategic questions, the crucial dilemmas, the giant issues confronting the state of Israel is being analyzed fairly and squarely. On the other hand, I think the good news is that nobody really wants war. Nobody wants a full-scale war. The difference is that if Nasrallah doesn't want a war, he will not wage it. If Israel doesn't want a war, it still might have to wage it. And there's no politics. There's just the facts that there's a whole region, the whole northern part of Israel is deserted. Communities are dismantled. Beautiful Metula is all but gone. I've been to Manara a couple of months ago. It's heartbreaking. And for the residents of this area to get back home, the equation will have to change. So I'm afraid to say that I'm not sure that I trust the people who make the decision, but I trust that deciding that a war is inevitable might be the right decision.
I mean, a question that I think about a lot is almost the resilience, the stamina of the Israeli people, and how much more of this they can take going into another all-out war and a long war. But I wanted to ask you about this, which is the specific attack, the pager, the walkie-talkie attack. Privately, many people around the world, I think, do admire its technical ingenuity, its prowess. But others obviously have condemned the loss of civilian life as well. But the question that comes to my mind is, how can Israel pull this off, do this? Similarly, not long ago, killing Ismail Haniyeh, apparently, in Tehran in an amazing operation, right in the room he was sleeping in. And yet still I come back to, how were they not able to see what in some ways was much more obvious and much more basic, a threat from across the fence on October the 7th?
First of all, unlike you, Jonathan, Yonit, and I have to reiterate that Israel has not taken responsibility neither on the pager's attack nor on Ismail Haniyeh's assassination. But yes, somebody did it, the pager attack and Ismail Haniyeh's assassination, and Muhammad Def and Fuad Shukr, and lots of brilliant and amazing and intelligence-oriented operations which will get into the Hall of Fame of security services and intelligence and espionage operations. But, it's easier to explain the successes than it is to explain the failure. It's easy to explain the success because Israel has an amazingly advanced technology and amazing intelligence operations, and the best and the brightest are there. But the best and the brightest sometimes fail because they fail to see reality in front of them, because of preconceptions, because of political upheaval, because of many, many reasons which I'm sure Yonit and I will spend decades reporting and covering and asking and probing and investigating. So the question of failure is something which will accompany us perhaps until somebody up there decides it is time to have a special investigative committee, which Israel should have promptly.
When we have this perspective of a year on, and I assume the name Netanyahu will come on again and again, it just connects to what you were saying. He obviously does not want a commission of inquiry, and he knows why. But to me, I think, and to many Israelis, this sort of terrible feeling of, I don't know if it's brokenness or being shattered after October 7th has to do with the backbone of Israeli society, which is the military. And that feeling of it will always be there for us. We'll go to the military. Our children were, our parents did, but we, the contract is that the military will save us if need be. And that obviously failed miserably and terribly. And I wonder for you, I don't know if it's on the personal level, on the professional level, did you somehow bounce back from that? What do you say to yourself when those thoughts come in your mind?
If I ask you, Yonit, or your neighbor, or your sister-in-law, do you trust the Israeli military? Will you call them in a moment of need? You will tell me that the answer is yes. And you know them, you know the generals, you know the kids who are fighting now in Gaza. I know so many of them, so many of those in the brass and in the ranks. I've seen them. I've been to Rafah a couple of months ago. I've been to Gaza half a year ago. These are people that I trust. I criticize. I investigate. I ask hard questions. But yes, these are people that I trust. And I got to tell you, Yonit, that unlike the chief of staff and the chief of the intelligence and the chief of the Shin Bet, unlike them, you haven't heard Bibi Netanyahu up until this day, a year after it happened, taking full responsibility. But you said fairly and rightfully that the name Netanyahu will come up sometime. And I'll tell you my problem. I think I met him for the first time in 1988, when he first rose into Israeli politics. I covered his first victory in the elections in 1996. As you well know, I've covered all of his victories ever since in Likud headquarters, and I've seen every speech that he made on the nights of his victories. And I've seen him change in 2016, just when the investigation started. And I've seen him starting to aim all ammunition he has, political and popular and charisma and his base, towards the most important and crucial and the finest institutions of Israeli democracy. And when you said that something is broken, that's broken. Israeli politics is broken. Israeli society is broken because leadership has led us there. Therefore, I think that when we indict Netanyahu, and he will have to approach the witness stand in his own trial on December 2nd, but the true indictment, if courts are open, if it happens, if there's no good reason to postpone, yes, exactly. But I think there's no indictment like the indictment that history will serve. Not necessary for October 7th, but for October 6th, for everything that happened before that, for the judicial overhaul that he unleashed, for the attack on Israeli institutions, the democratic institutions of our democracy, for everything that happened up until October 6th, and for everything that happens ever since October 8th, for the fact that nobody is held responsible in the political leadership, for the fact that nobody is accountable, for the fact that they have normalized Itamar Ben-Gvir, and for the fact that the extremists have taken us hostages, all of us. The extreme is dictating the policy of this government. That's, for me, the gravest, the most difficult, and the most heartbreaking indictment that I can think of. So yes, I trust many people still in our military leadership. I do think that they have, they have responsibility for the most terrible fiasco in our history. But they have taken that responsibility. Others have not.
I mean, you're talking about feeling broken and the society being broken, and in a way, you're saying there's one man who broke it. And that's quite a sobering thought. I want to take you back to something I think you said very soon after October the 7th, and you talked about it as a kind of Jewish experience. That sense of vulnerability and abandonment that many communities felt, where there was no one coming, there was no army coming for them. And that was reminiscent of Jews in decades and centuries past. It strikes me that for all the fighting and the heavy military hardware that's been used in the south, on Gaza this last year, Israelis still can't live in the south of the country. Despite the extraordinary pager attack this week, Israelis cannot live, as you said, those communities are dismantled and empty, in the north of the country. These are big parts of the country that are in effect uninhabitable in terms of safety. And they cannot get their hostages back. And so, to me, this invites a question about the Zionist dream and revolution, really, which was that somehow Jews would be stronger and less vulnerable than they had been. And I'm just wondering if everything you're describing, whether you still have, in a way, despite being in Israel, that Jewish feeling that you were invoking and evoking after October the 7th.
Jonathan, have your parents emigrated from Europe from Eastern Europe to the UK, or your grandparents?
My great-grandparents would have done that, and my mother came in the other direction. She was born in Petah Tikva and made it to London. So it's a complicated story.
And she emigrated to London, and your great-great-parents emigrated to London. Unlike Yonit's parents and grandparents and my own parents who emigrated to this country, who made a better deal? Are we safer here than you are there? Can we celebrate the victory of Zionism? I think we can. I think we can. And the fact that Israel hasn't won still this war is not because Zionism has failed. It's because this war for the time being is unwinnable. It is unwinnable because Hamas is still there, because somebody here doesn't want to talk about the day after, because somebody here doesn't want to strike a deal, because as long as the war in the south continues, Nasrallah said it just on Thursday night, the war in the north will continue, because as long as we don't want to wage another costly, long and bloody war, the residents of the north will not be able to go back. That has nothing to do with the fact that this is still the national home of the Jewish people, the only one in which we can thrive, the only one in which we can be the masters of our own destiny. The set of facts around us is of course, it's depressing. Yonit has opened her new newscast on Thursday evening with 2 names more of soldiers who have fallen on Thursday in the north. On Thursday morning, I interviewed the mother of the first female soldier, a paramedic, who was killed the day before yesterday in Rafah. I couldn't hold my tears. We keep paying a terrible price. The hostages are still there. The ring of fire that Iran was orchestrating around us is closing on us. So, yes, the facts are sober. But if you ask most Israelis I know, and I think Yonit will vouch for that, will we come out of it? Yes. We will rise? Yes. How will it happen? When will it happen? How will we fix everything that's broken? How will we turn this moment of crisis into a moment of grace? I wanted to say God knows, but I'm not sure he's listening. Those are questions that I don't think anybody can answer now. And I hope that the reason for which I am giving you this fiery Zionist speech is not because I'm delusional or unplugged or detached from reality. It's because I know that the commitment that most of us feel to this place is ever stronger and ever deeper, not because, but despite our leadership, not because, but despite reality, not because, but despite our enemies.
I think that it's a question of what happened to us as a society. I grew up under that story of Ron Arad, who will never know what happened to him, and suddenly Israel is somehow okay with having 101 Ron Arad.
The hostages are the most painful and the most defining question of the whole reality around us. We are the masters of our own destiny. The fact that this war hasn't been won yet is because of many reasons. But the hostages, it's another story. I read someone wrote today in a column that there's a beautiful project on the IDF radio station every Memorial Day. It's called "In a Minute Will Become a Poem." And that has to do with soldiers who have written poems and then were killed in the battlefield. So the headline, the name of this project is "In a Minute Will Become a Poem." The hostages have become a poem. Instead of news, they have become a memory. We all speak of them almost in past tense. That's the biggest, the most terrible tragedy that I can think of. And yes, Hamas is stubborn, Sinwar is cruel, they are refusing, they don't want to strike a deal these days, but our government is accountable to us. And we can say now for sure that our government has torpedoed a deal both last July, both last April, and both last January. And I got to tell you that when I sat last spring in front of two senior sources from within the negotiating team, and they told me back then that the atmosphere up there is that nobody wants a deal, that Netanyahu gives them a mandate and then takes it back. And one of them told me, I was heartbroken when I realized this is going nowhere. And the other said another chilling sentence that sounds even more terrible now. He said, once the IDF goes into Rafah, there's a practical, a viable chance that hostages will die in the course of our military maneuver in Rafah. He said it a couple of days before we enter Rafah. And you know what happened a couple of weeks ago when 6 young hostages were found dead after they were murdered at gunpoint in Rafah. And the last sentence that this guy told me, and he allowed me to record him, he went on record. He said, there are hostages I know who died mentally before they died physically. It can take years, and our hostages are dying there. Our time is not running out. It has already run up. This is Ron Arad, Yonit. And when I try to think about conversations that I had with the late Meir Dagan, the head of Mossad, with David Meidan, who orchestrated the deal to get Gilad Shalit back after 5.5 years in captivity. And I asked David Meidan, how did you convince the same Bibi Netanyahu to release 1,027 terrorists, 280 of them with blood on their hands? One of them was a ruthless Hamas leader by the name of Yahya Sinwar. How did you convince him? And he said, I told him Gilad might die there. Well, now we have 101 Gilads, and they will die them unless leadership starts to listen to the people, because there's a vast majority of Israelis who signed on to the deal. There's a vast majority of Israelis who are in favor of the deal. And I know, one, that the hostages will define us. They will define the way this war ends and the way we emerge out of this war. And the other thing that I know is that the debate about the hostage deal is not really a debate between hawks and doves, between hardliners and softies, between opposition and coalition, between Ben-Gvir and Gadi Eisenkot. It is a debate about who we will be. It is a debate between the now and the ever, what we call Achshav ve'anetzach. It's a debate that will define the ethos of the State of Israel. It's the debate between those who prefer life over land and people over a biblical notion of total victory. This is the real dilemma concerning a hostage deal. And we're still in the crossroad. And you know what happens when you stay for too long in a crossroad? Somebody will come hit you. And they are getting hit. And I got to tell you, I went to Hirsch Goldberg's Shiva a week ago. And I thought, how many hells can a parent go through? To see your kid's hand blows off, to see him being kidnapped to Gaza, everybody tells you he's dead, then all of a sudden you get a sign of life in April with this video of him, and then they tell you he's murdered. I think that this country will not be able to heal unless they come back. We will not be able to return to ourselves unless they return to us. There's no question about it.
Very much echoing what Rachel Goldberg, Poland, is saying herself, right? Who will we be if we don't bring them back? But Ilana, if we're honest, and I don't know how to say this in percentage points, but there is a different vision for Israel. And there is a different, you called it the Israel of forever, right? Of Am HaNetzach. There are the people who will say to you, to everything you've been saying so far, first of all, what unleashed this hell on us was the protests against the judicial overhaul, was the pilots saying they will not show up for reserve duty. That is what signaled to Sinwar that he can now attack Israel. And the same people are saying, of course, we want the hostages home, but we don't want to end the war. That is a mistake. There is a whole, logic in that thought. And it seems like the gap between those two visions for Israel, not only visions for the future, but looking back at what has happened in the past year, are very, very different. Is there any way to bridge that conversation?
I want to prepare an amazing meal, but I just don't want to study how to cook. I want to get everything that you can give me, but I don't want to pay the price. Anybody who's not willing to pay the price cannot say that they truly want the hostages back. That's for once. Second, yes, of course, there's a legitimate debate. Should we keep on fighting, stand tall and stay strong and go into a war of attrition, or opt for a ceasefire and a hostage deal? That's, Yonit, a legitimate debate. But when it comes to the question of the fate of hundreds of Israelis who were deserted and neglected and left to their own sake, it happened to them once. Will we let it happen to them twice? That is something which I will ask anybody who opposes a deal now, and it goes much beyond the legitimate arguments that you cited. And when it comes to the judicial overhaul, I got to tell you two things. One, what do they expect? Those who blame the protest, those who blame the demonstrations against the judicial overhaul, what did they expect? That someone who opposes an attack on Israeli democracy, someone who fears for the fate of Israeli democracy, of the rule of law, of the independence of the Supreme Court, what should they do? Sit at home and light candles? Sing songs? Write a poem? I mean, all of a sudden a demonstration is a show of you being unpatriotic? That being said, I've been thinking a lot after I met Rachel Pauline Goldberg, and I saw this special color of a religious person, this specific from the Baka in Jerusalem. You know them, Yonit. Specific type of what you'd call, Jonathan, modern Orthodox. It's kind of different in Israel. And I figured there
liberal
must be,
and religious and American.
Exactly.
Very, very rare bird.
Very American.
Yes.
And I figured there must be another way. Can there be something, any kind of dynamics that will come from somewhere and cool everything down and bring the temperatures of the rift and the debate and the argument and the demonstrations to bring the temperatures down? That unit is something that perhaps the protest doesn't understand and shouldn't understand, because protest has to be protest. But you and I, as reporters, as spectators, can perhaps observe that the rage doesn't really lead to any kind, not only of reconciliation, not only of solution, to any kind of listening on the other side of the aisle. On the contrary, it galvanizes the base, the famous base, and it solidifies the extremists. So something should happen. The problem is that it should happen from above, and above you have the same leadership that causes all the, this vicious cycle. So yes, I think there's something to it. And when it comes to the decision, not to sign on to the reserve service. I think there are second thoughts within the protest itself. I have the feeling. But when it comes to the accusation that the protest is the problem, if the protest is the problem, then democracy is a problem. And democracy is, I forgot the saying, but it's perhaps not the best, but the lesser of all. It's the one way of living that I sign on.
It's the worst system anyone's thought of, except for all the others.
Exactly.
Is the line. I mean, I on the politics, can we go back to the question of Netanyahu? Because I'm curious what you think is Israelis' relationship with this man. There are why they cannot quite make this break from him in the sense of him going. I look around the world and I see, Joe Biden, who Democrats thought was too old, he's no longer the nominee. I see Boris Johnson in this country who failed, he's gone. Liz Truss failed, she's gone. The failure of Netanyahu on October the 7th, and as you put it brilliantly actually, in the October the 6th and October the 8th, is so stark, and yet there he still is. Now, there are political answers to that about coalition and arithmetic, but I'm more interested in underneath that, whether Israelis are somehow dependent on him, even codependent, bound to him in a way that means the two are sort of stuck together. But tell me how you see it.
You know what the difference is between all the leaders that you mentioned and Aaron Netanyahu? He is bigger than life. And Israel truly needs, leaders who are bigger than life. Ben-Gurion, Begin, in a way Arik Sharon, and for sure Netanyahu.
Yitzhak Rabin.
Rabin, of course, yes. But Rabin was in a sense more mundane. Netanyahu, with the charisma, with the clout, with the English, with the accent, with the intellect, with the education, and with the special rapport and the special frequency that he has managed to locate and refine and define between himself and his base. But it's not only between himself and his base. Even his opponents will agree that he has become bigger than life. You can hate him, you can love him, you cannot ignore him, and I think that explains why many people who would agree that he failed would tell you there's no one better, there's no substitute, there's no alternative, there's no real figure on the opposition. And in a sense they are right. There's no other leader of this magnitude in the Israeli political landscape. That being said, I think the problem is that when you see the indications of what's coming out of the conversations between Netanyahu and the hostages, between his wife and the hostages, of what's coming out with regard to the messing up with politics and trying to substitute the Minister of Defense in the midst of war, at the same time telling you that an investigative committee cannot be founded because we are in the middle of a war, and that the government cannot be changed because we are in the middle of the war, and elections cannot be held because we are in the middle of a war. So it doesn't really make sense. But it doesn't matter to people who see him as the one and only protector of the fate and destiny of the Jewish people. And I think I heard it from a senior official who is reliable in my eyes, and he's not a big fan of Netanyahu. He told me it's not political motivations that are driving Netanyahu to torpedo a deal. It's his will and his conviction to reclaim his legacy and to lead Israel to what he perceives as true victory in this war. And that might be true, but I think the motives of a leader are much less important than the place he is driving us at. And Netanyahu is driving us nowadays nowhere. And I think that the fact that he has 4 more votes than the opposition in the Knesset is important, but the notion and the sentiment and the feeling of the vast majority of Israeli is also important. Still, we are a parliamentary democracy, and until it changes in the Knesset, nothing will change really in our in our practical reality.
But that means two things. One is that protests, make no difference, is one question, I guess. Because they did make a difference. It did make a difference when it came to the judicial overhaul. It gave power to the court. Maybe it gave power to the reservists, the protests in the street. What you're saying now is that there's such a sort of detachment between what the people want and the government that there is really nothing to do, unless I understand you in a way that you think differently. And also, then where we're heading, it seems, is a forever war. And if we met on this podcast in December and talked about what month the war might end, now we're saying what year? I mean, is that where we're heading?
The good news is that wars end. Sometime, somehow, they end. And the other good news is that there's enough stamina and energy and common sense within the Israeli public, yes, eventually to drive leadership into a better place. And it's not that protests, that the demonstrations do have an impact or don't have an impact. It's a matter of dynamics. You see what happens with Gideon Sa'ar. Now it happens, now it doesn't. It's a matter of political dynamics. Yes, the protest can impact the political dynamics. That's what I'm saying, Yonit. It can impact the political dynamics. Nowadays, it doesn't have an impact. You're right. Nowadays, the American politics doesn't have an impact. Look what happens. They have the strongest leverage on earth. Be it Biden, be it Kamala Harris, be it Trump. By sheer declarations, he can make a difference. But they don't make a difference because the Biden administration doesn't want a war in Lebanon, but they, even less than that, want to somehow damage Kamala Harris's campaign. So, and someone very well acquainted with the Biden administration told me a week and a half ago, they will do nothing. They will do nothing to drive Netanyahu truly into a hostage deal. Yes, they go through the motion, they meet with families, and they say the right things, but they will not use their leverage. So in a way, anything that could drive us into the end of this war will not happen because of politics here and politics there. It will not happen in the foreseeable future. It will happen somehow because, as we said, wars end. And because I think we should keep talking sense to our audience. We should keep reminding them of Romy and Naama and Liri and Shlomo Mansour. And when I think about these people, and I have personal contacts with many of the families, I think about, what would I have done if I had a spouse there or a son there? And that's what is driving me at keeping mentioning them and covering them and interviewing them and mentioning ourselves, mentioning ourselves that we cannot normalize the fact that they have become another story, that they have become an item in our lineup. That cannot be the case. It simply cannot be. We cannot wear this, yellow pin and be satisfied that we have done something. And you're right. Eventually, it has to do with leadership. And I just saw before we started this recording that Nitzan Alon, the head of the command in charge with the hostages, said that the presumably new proposal that Israel has served to the Americans by Gal Hirsch, the advisor to the prime minister with regard to the hostages, is just a fraud. So something wrong is going on there, something very wrong, and we have to keep covering and mentioning it and investigating it and opposing it. As simple as that.
This may have to be our last question, but I want to mention something that Amos Harel, the Haaretz military affairs analyst who was on the podcast last week, very frankly, I thought, very honestly admitted that he does not feel as much for Palestinian suffering as he used to, that the capacity in him to empathise or feel those losses has diminished in him. As I say, I was very struck by the honesty of that observation, and I just wondered if something similar or not has happened to you, and whether you feel something similar has happened to many people in Israel since October the 7th, for all the reasons that we can imagine.
I know that we got to keep reminding ourselves that there is a tragedy in Gaza, that we are not covering it enough. We are covering it in terms of numbers and incidents, not in terms of the human stories and the human tragedy. And we got to make sure that those who are out to take our lives do not get to take our values. And those are values of compassion and the care for the other, partly because we used to be the other for so many years. And yes, it falls back on notions of victimhood and Jewish tragedy that we all know so well and see it in our family photos, and it's part of our, very sense of being. But when I ask myself, who will we be when it's all over? I ask ourselves, who can we be after we've seen so much evil and consumed so much rage? And I bet that's what Amos was perhaps trying to say. We have consumed so much rage and have seen and witnessed so much evil. I got to tell you that we are working nowadays on Uvda on a couple of projects that every time I go into the editing room, I figure we think that we've seen it all. The horror and the brutality and the cruelty and the horrifying and terrifying atrocities of October 7th, we haven't seen it all. We haven't seen most of it. And so that's a difficult question. We have to still be compassionate, but it's difficult. It really is.
This reminds me of what Dan Goldfuss said, who commanded the 98 Paratroopers Division in Khan Yunis in an interview. He said that we need to safeguard our values for us, not lose them. That's the important part of it, and it's that we can't become our enemies. Ilana, it's always
you want something optimistic?
Yes, please, because sometimes wars end is not a very optimistic.
No,
it's not. I'm sure you can do better.
It's not the best. Yeah. I tried to come up with something better, and I got to tell you that I mentioned it's projects that we are working on, and when I listen to the voices of people who went out of themselves to rescue others, when I meet a nurse in Soroka, in the hospital in the southern part of Israel, and she tells me about 36 hours that she worked without breathing. When I hear just today of 80 years old kibbutznikim who volunteer to work in places in the north to collect eggs and apples and pears, I am reminded of a couple of lines that I prepared for you. And Yonit, you know who is this person that I love so much and introduces me to successful Broadway musicals. And you know Hadestown?
Yes, I haven't seen it. I think Jonathan has seen it.
I've seen it 3 times. Hadestown is an absolute winner, so I'm very ready for this.
Hadestown, and Anais Mitchell, who wrote the lyrics, wrote a couple of beautiful lines that when I think about those Israelis who rose up to the occasion and did something extraordinary, be it military bravery or civil heroism, I think of these words. And she wrote like this: "Some birds sing when the sun shines bright. Our praise is not for them, but the ones who sing in the dead of night, we raise our cups to them. Some flowers bloom where the green grass grows. Our praise is not to them, but the ones who bloom in the bitter snow, we raise our cups to them." So we still have people to raise our cups for, and I wish that when we speak again, we'll have plenty of more reasons, perhaps 101 more reasons, to raise our cups to them.
Amen to that. And we raise our cups to you, Ilana, and we're very happy that you exist in this world and that you agreed to talk to us.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Yoni. Thanks, Jonathan. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you, Ilana. Thanks so much.
Shabbat Shalom.
Well, she is, as we know from her previous appearances on this podcast, an extraordinary speaker. This is not the main thing, of course, but she's amazing in English. She anchors a TV news program in Hebrew. Obviously, she's a native Spanish speaker, and now we discover she speaks Arabic as well. There is no
This
end.
is new even to me. I mean, that kind of it's very good Arabic.
I know. So there's no end to her talents, but great wisdom there. And I just was very struck by her expression of what we've heard it from, as you mentioned in the interview, from Rachel Goldberg-Pollen, but this thing about the hostages, it's going to define us. And I think we hear this again and again because there's deep truth in that.
Look, Ilana is a juggernaut of Israeli media and journalism, and I love having her on the podcast because I feel like people from outside Israel who don't know her are, introduced to the way that she's, I would even say, a poet and a journalist, just in the sense of how she would phrase things for us, try to help us make sense of things. I know how many times personally I would go to her and sort of ask her to do that. I was, in our conversation, I must say, first of all, I think in a way, if we compare the conversation we had with her in December and now, this is in some ways even more somber in tone. Because of everything that we have gone through, I think it makes sense, but it's, if you'd asked me a year ago, I would say probably after a year, something would be a little more cheery. I'm very struck by what she had to say, and I'm glad we had her on.
Very much so. That's the purpose of these conversations, these reflections on this last year. And our instinct that she would be just the right person for that was borne out, I think, by that conversation. So we have awards to hand out. I think a Chuzpah award should go all the way over to South Africa, to the South African government, indeed, who through what is known as a state-owned company, an SOC, so it didn't do this directly, instead through a venue known as Constitution Hill, it withdrew its facilities from a conference that was coming up, which was going to bring together Israelis, Palestinians, others, for a dialogue that was about the future, but also drawing lessons from South Africa's own extraordinary experience in the 1990s, emerging out of apartheid. Guests who were due to take part include people who've been on this podcast: Yuval Sheni, Fania Sulzberger, Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib, and others. Were all going to get together at the very last moment. Constitution Hill, a venue that, as I say, operated by a company owned and directed by the government, said we will no longer be prepared to host you. It seems it followed pressure from protesters, part of the BDS movement, boycott, divestment, sanctions, but with the backing of the South African government. Now, you look at the thrust of what this conference was going to talk about. You look at the people involved, all those taking part, you look at the content of what they wanted to discuss. It is so clear that this was a venture designed to end the pain and suffering, to look forward to a future of coexistence, of getting beyond war and to some kind of accord between Israelis and Palestinians. But maybe the odd word here or the presence of a speaker there enabled people to say this is justifying, and all the language came out about colonialism and genocide and all those things you're used to. Of course, South African government were the ones who brought the genocide case against Israel to the International Court of Justice, and so they pulled the plug. With great admiration, kudos to the organizers of the conference. They have deliberately not given up. They are relocating. They're going to host it somewhere else. They found a venue at almost no notice. And they are getting together carrying on with the speakers who are there. But a lot of speakers dropped out because they thought this is going to be too much trouble and bad publicity. So a Chuzpah award really to the South African government, which likes to profess that it wants to see what's best for Palestinians and peace and so on. And yet here, a small baby step in that direction, and it cut it off. And I think it deserves a dishonorable mention in our chutzpah category for that.
Definitely not going to argue, and also I would invite our listeners to listen to our episode with Fania Oz and with Ahmed Fouad El Khatib. It's our episode 148 from April. I think maybe you could get a sense of what that kind of discussion would look like. I think you and I both emerged from that discussion a little bit more optimistic about this region and about the world. Mensch Award, sir?
We absolutely
Perhaps.
should. I think that is your honour again.
Again, rarely
Yes,
an honor that is bestowed upon me.
I feel you're making a bit of a sort of rearguard action to grab the Mensch Award. It's all yours, Judy.
Could be. I think we have over the years given a Mensch Award to a bear, but never to a TV series, or perhaps maybe more accurately a cast of characters and writers. And we're giving our Mensch Award of the week in the spirit of the special event at the Emmys to The West Wing. I would argue the best series on television since the invention of television. And this week on at the Emmy Awards, they were celebrating 25 years. And it made me think, I don't think we're not arguing, right, that it's the best series ever on television. And I could not think about that year. First of all, when The West Wing was on, that every year the actors were crowding in the best supporting actor, right? There was like best supporting actor, everyone on The West Wing. And it was this year when the late and great John Spencer won. John Spencer, who portrayed Leo McGarry, the chief of staff, and he died unexpectedly in the seventh season of the series. So he then won the Emmy. And I remember his speech because he was so gloriously talking about the cast of characters and the writing. And he said, we receive gold every week, and a writer is only as good as the material he gets. And then he says, so thank you for this award, but it is deliciously redundant. And I couldn't forget that speech when I was looking at this really miraculous kind of series where everything seemed to work. Writer Aaron Sorkin, directed by Tommy Schlamme, who is, a genius in that. The walk and talk is all him, but obviously a cast of characters that you could just, pray and hope for, but only probably once in the history of television actually get.
So we have found yet another point of agreement between us. There are so many. The West Wing is, there will be purists, I'm sure, who will come on and say, oh, but The Wire, The Sopranos, Breaking Bad and all that. I think in terms of the TV series, I just loved watching more than any other. I think that's the thing about The West Wing. It was in its own very sweet, sort of sometimes sentimental way, incredibly inspiring. And just brilliantly written and fast-paced and superbly acted. We all, people who love politics loved that show. Funnily enough, there are not often times when I miss being full-time based in Washington correspondent, as I was when The West Wing, I think, just was about to debut. But this is one of them, because this week there's actually an event at the White House hosted, I think, by Jill Biden, where they're bringing together surviving members of the cast. And that is one, I don't miss all the press conferences and all the other things, but I kind of would love to be there for that. It was the show I sort of loved most. I think maybe we'll put it like that. And we miss it. So a worthy winner for our Mensch Award. Everyone involved in The West Wing. And while we're talking of Mensches, I think we have a Mensch who deserves a proper unholy thank you.
I think so. This week we would want to give our very big thank you to our sound editor, Omer Primat, who's been with us since the beginning, dealing with every possible whim Jonathan and I could think of. And believe me, we have had our whims, to say nothing of co-hosts forgetting to press record, guests not being in any sort of place they can record, and other things that Omer would always fix and save. So we're giving our heart to him and our huge gratitude. And we shall also say our thank you to Michal Porat, of course. And also, we will meet next week, Jonathan.
We will. We'll see you then. And to Omer, yes, very much part of our unholy family from, as you said, from the very start. So we wish him huge luck in next moves and adventures. And yeah, we'll see each other next week.